The AAIB's preliminary report for the Air India 171 crash is out for all of us to read, and it reveals a very terrifying scenario. The aircraft took off normally and then suddenly both the engines shut down. But here is what's even scarier. The fuel cutoff switches moved on their own, or at least that's what they have said. Were the pilots fighting against their own aircraft, or was one of the pilots lying? I guess we'll never know. But here's what we know. The initial report is out, and let me break it down for you.
One asks the other, why did you cut off? The other says, I did not do anything.
It doesn't explain the Wall Street Journal report that both fuel control levers were placed to the cutoff position.
But already this tragedy fits an unsettling pattern. In recent years, Air India has faced multiple technical incidents.
Fuel control switches, firstly they're gated and they have guards on the side. The second part is that the switch, the fuel control switch has to be pulled out and then put it to run. Similarly, if it has to be cut off, it has to be pulled up and then put it down to shut off. Now this switch cannot be operated externally. It has to be done internally by a human interface. Point number one.
The Boeing 787 began its takeoff from Ahmedabad's runway 23 at 8:07:37 UTC time. Everything in the cockpit followed normal procedures. The aircraft reaches V1 speed, which is also known as the decision speed, at 8:08:33 seconds, rotated at 8:08:35 seconds, and lifted off at 8:08:39 seconds. Just 3 seconds after the liftoff, it hit the 180 knots mark, exactly as expected for the climb phase. Perfectly normal as of now. But at 8:08:42 UTC, and according to the EAFR data, the fuel cutoff switch of the first engine moved from the run position to the cutoff position, and 1 second later, the second engine also did this. With the switches now set to cut off, fuel flow to both the engines had stopped pretty much instantly, and the N1 and N2 speeds were reducing from their takeoff values. What that means is the speed of the turbines was continuously reducing, and both engines are losing thrust. And in this critical state, the RAT was deployed automatically. RAT is a last resort system designed to provide emergency electrical power when all main sources on board are lost. The RAT's deployment this early in flight is rare and signals just how insane the situation was. And the aircraft had lost all other power sources. Now, normally pilots are trained for single engine operation in case one engine goes down, but nobody trains us for dual engine failures, that too right after takeoff, when there is very little altitude and very slow speeds to work with. The report also rules out fuel contamination since the engines didn't fail at exactly the same time. These 90 seconds transformed this very normal takeoff into an emergency that the crew couldn't deal with. The chain of events was so quick that even the most experienced pilot would have struggled to respond in such a situation. To really understand what happened next, we need to look at the cockpit voice recorder, because those recordings capture the initial reaction of the pilots when the situation was unfolding in front of their eyes. The pilot's final moments, as captured by the cockpit voice recorder, reveals an immediate and intense effort to make sense of what was happening. At exactly 8:08:42 UTC, just after the first engines lost fuel, one pilot asked, "Why did you cut off?" The other pilot replied instantly, "I did not do so." This brief exchange highlights their confusion. Neither had commanded the fuel shut-off valve to go to the cutoff position, yet both engines were shutting down. Within 10 seconds of the engine shutdown, the crew acted at 8:08:52 UTC. The first engine's fuel cutoff switch was moved back to the run position, and the second switch also followed at 8:08:56 UTC. This triggered the full authority digital engine control, or the FADEX system. You can think of it as the brain of the engine, to begin an automatic relight sequence. Essentially what it means is the FADEX system was trying to restart the engines now. The report also notes that the engine 2's exhaust gas temperature began to rise and engine 1's core speed started to recover, indicating that the relight logic was functioning and the pilots were actively trying to restore power. Despite all of these efforts, the loss of thrust continued as the engines could not maintain the necessary speed for sustained operation. Now, there is no indication in the report that one of the pilots inadvertently or by mistake, touched the fuel cutoff switches. In fact, the switches have a locking mechanism And we will talk about all of that at the end of this video. The 1 second interval between the switches moving to the cutoff position suggests a sequence that is still under investigation. Because if a pilot would have done it inadvertently, they would have only touched one of the switches. And even if they would have touched both of the switches, both of them would be instant, right? There will not be a 1 second difference. So that is still under investigation. We can't say anything because the report doesn't say anything about it. So I guess we'll have to wait for the final report to come. The final communication from the cockpit was a clear Mayday, Mayday, Mayday call at 8:09:05 UTC. The air traffic controller tried to respond, but there were no further communication from the aircraft. Now let's talk about the Ram Air Turbine. Isn't a backup battery or a simple generator. It's a very small propeller that drops out the fuselage, spinning in the airstream to provide just enough hydraulic and electrical power to keep essential systems alive. We're talking about the bare minimums: flight controls, primary instruments, and emergency radios. That's it. Everything else goes dark. The report and the CCTV footage both confirm the rat was fully deployed even before the aircraft cleared the airport parameter. And the EAFR data backed this up to the very second. Now this visual evidence paired with the flight data leaves no doubt about the sequence. Engines fail, rat deploys, and then the aircraft immediately starts to descend. Now here's the thing, the rat is designed for emergency situations only at an altitude where there is plenty of speed to spin the propeller fast enough that it generates the necessary power required. And when the aircraft is taking off, the speed is very less for the rat to generate enough power. The data shows the pilots kept the nose up at about 8 degrees on impact, fighting to maintain altitude and control. But this wasn't a glide from a very high altitude with enough time to troubleshoot the problem. It was a struggle to keep the aircraft flying with pretty much no power, right after takeoff with the ground approaching fast. In those final moments, the crew tried to restart the engine, but it was too little too late. The report gives us a detailed, almost minute by minute account of these events, but even with all this data, what stands out is that the engines didn't fail on their own. The sequence of power loss, rat deployment, and the crew's response raises questions that go far beyond a routine engine failure. The preliminary report leaves us with more questions than answers, but it gives us one important fact, and that is the engines didn't fail on their own. Someone or something caused those fuel cutoff switches to move without the pilot's intent, triggering a chain reaction of events that no crew could recover from. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a warning. Aviation safety systems are designed to prevent accidents. But what happens when the aircraft itself becomes the failure? The AAIB investigation now enters its most critical phase, determining whether this was a freak malfunction or something far more concerning. One thing is certain, whatever caused those fuel switches to move, it will change the way we think about aviation safety. Now, let's talk about what I think about this whole situation. I'm no expert, so take whatever I'm going to say now with a pinch of salt. These are again my opinions. I'm going to write it down somewhere here. This is just speculation at this point. In the safety bulletin that came back in 2018, it clearly mentions that some of the 737s operators, not one operator but operators, had their fuel cutoff switch disengaged. That means it was not guarded, and someone by mistake can, change the position of the fuel switch. And Boeing themselves said in that safety bulletin that they have used similar parts on their other models as well. What does that mean? I don't have the answer to that, honestly. But what I know is Boeing has a history of violations. They have a history of hiding stuff. In the MCAS system back in 2019-2020, I'll put some articles. The first crash that was caused because of the MCAS system, nobody even knew that it existed. The MCAS system, nobody even knew. So all the blame was pushed under the rug on the pilot. That's the easiest thing. Who's there to defend them? And everything was hidden. And that was a case solved. And everyone accepted that it was pilot's error until there were more crashes, one after the other. That is when we finally got to know, in a hurry to compete with Airbus, और लोगों की जान गई. And then there were more crashes. And then finally FAA stood up and said, it is the aircraft's fault, the MCAS system. I'll attach a video documentary down below. You can watch it and understand what exactly went. So Boeing as a company have had a history of lying to people, history of manipulating the investigations, and I just don't trust them at this point. I just don't trust them. And yes, it can completely be a pilot's error. There is no doubt about that. In fact, 70 to 80% accidents happen because of pilot error. These machines are very advanced, okay, and that is why I'm confused, and that is why I can't give you a rigid answer like this is what happened. But let's just think about this for a second. Okay, let's talk about a couple of situations now. So let's say the 2018 safety bulletin is exactly what happened in this case. So the safety lock on that switch was disengaged, and by mistake a pilot would have touched it. Again, the question arises, did the pilot touch both the switches together or just one of them? If he had touched just one of the switches, only one engine would have gone down. If he would have touched both the fuel switches, they would have shut down together at the same time. There will not be that 1 second gap. So essentially what I'm trying to say is both the switches inadvertently being shut down is very highly unlikely. So let's talk about the fuel switch. So दो fuel switches हैं. Let's just say 2018 वाला जो safety bulletin है, that is true, and that is the same issue in this aircraft also, that there is no guard on the switch. कोई गार्ड वार्ड नहीं है, गलती से पायलट का हाथ लग गया, किसी भी पायलट का लग गया, इट डजंट मैटर. सो फिर दो सिचुएशंस आती हैं. हाथ जब लगा तो एक स्विच बंद हुआ या दोनों बंद हुए? अगर एक स्विच बंद हुआ तो दोनों इंजन्स बंद कैसे हुए? ऑब्वियसली दैट इज नॉट द सिचुएशन. और इनएडवर्टेंटली दोनों स्विचेस एक बार हाथ लगाने से बंद हो गए. लेट्स जस्ट अज्यूम दैट इज ट्रू. देन व्हाई इज देयर अ 1 second gap that has been recorded on the EAFR? So I don't know what is true, what is not true, what exactly went wrong there. If we only have to look at the data and we have to believe the data, like let's just say all of this is true, then the conclusion is it basically points out, it doesn't say it directly, but it nudges anyone who's reading the report towards thinking कि पायलट ने जानबूझ के, किसी भी दोनों में से किसी एक पायलट ने जानबूझ के उठाया और बंद कर दिया स्विच, both of them. It nudges you to think that way.
So I'm just editing this video, guys, and I'm reading a lot of these articles that are coming. The report clearly mentions engine 1 and engine 2 fuel cutoff switches transition from the run position to the cutoff position one after the other with a time gap of 1 second. It doesn't give any more information than that. It doesn't tell you it's a software problem. It doesn't tell you it's an electrical problem. It doesn't tell you that the pilot was trying to suicide. It doesn't tell you anything whatsoever. Regardless, I'm seeing these media houses who absolutely know that it was the pilot. Especially that guy, what's his name? Captain Steve. He is so rigid. His take is so rigid on this. Yahi ho sakta hai. Only this can happen. I've seen all of his videos and he seems very convinced that it is the error of the pilot. And like I said previously, it can very well be a pilot's fault, but the problem is we don't know. So we shouldn't be coming to conclusion. And I know a lot of you are thinking, gosh, it's a physical switch. There are no software involved. I hate to break this down to you. The button directly doesn't control the fuel cutoff valves. That is not how it works. It sends a signal. I believe it is the FADAC, but I'm not sure. And the FADAC sends another signal to the cutoff valve. A lot of software is involved in here. It can very well be an electrical fault or a software glitch, a million different things. So let's not jump to any conclusions. I'm going to use some rough words here, but let's just assume, hypothetical case, one of the pilots wanted to die that day. He wanted to suicide. He cut off both the engines. The second pilot didn't even notice it. He noticed it afterwards, and then he tried to restart. The second pilot tried to restart the engines. While the guy who wants to die is just waiting. ठीक है, कर लो आप, कर लो, restart कर लो, कर लो, कर लो. मैंने तो ऐसी गलती से दबा दिया था. What is happening here? The point I'm trying to make is, if one of the pilots wants to die and the second one obviously doesn't want to die, there will be some sort of friction on the radio, on the CVR, in the cockpit voice recorder. They will have some sort of fight in there going, some sort of friction between them. And that would have been easily captured on the CVR. But we do not have that, right? Don't jump to any conclusions. I'm not saying this is right or that is wrong, but my problem is the report. The report itself is my problem, because anyone who reads it, obviously, it is not directly, it's not saying anything directly, but it is hinting towards that it's a pirate's error. That is what it's hinting towards. The tone itself is as such. And nobody in the media is mentioning this, including Captain Steve, that Boeing has history of cutting corners, of manipulating investigations, and being successful in manipulating those investigations, and then being caught. We cannot just forget all of that. We have to put that into consideration. Air India crash report confirms fuel was cut off before that. The issue is this: July 11th at 5:40 p.m. Okay? Indian authorities confirmed. ये कौन सी authorities हैं? Confirmed that the fuel control switches on the Air India flight that crashed in June had been turned off shortly after takeoff, but said they had been turned back on before the impact. Okay? In a preliminary report released Friday. What day was it? On Friday? Friday was 11th. Friday was the 11th. Okay, that's when this article came, as you can see right here. But the report came on the 12th. Report to 12 तारीख को आई थी. That means they had the report before us. घूम फिर के आई है भाई, report आराम से आई है. The report said the switch went from run to the cutoff position one after another with a 1 second time gap. In the cockpit voice recording, one of the pilot is heard asking the other, why did he cut off? The report said the other pilot responded that he did not do so. Do you see how specific this article is? They had the report 1 day prior than us. For us, it was released on the midnight about 2-3 p.m. They had it well before that. Media. I just hate the modern media so much. So we have two situations here. Everyone wants you to believe that it is the fault of the pilots. The report doesn't say so.
Now, at this point, we cannot come to a conclusion with the available data. So unfortunately, we will have to wait for the final report. Now, I hope you found this breakdown insightful. Until next time, fly safe, take care of yourself.